Joining us now is Nebojša Vujović. He is the charge d'affaires of the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. And Joe DioGuardi is a lobbyist for Albanian American issues and heads the Albanian American Civic League. He is also a former congressman from the state of New York. Welcome to both you gentlemen.
Nice to be here.
Before we get into the history, Mr. Vujović, you said, I believe it was on the op-ed page of USA Today, that the agreement that was reached at Rambouillet, France, which NATO wants Milosevic to sign, is a fraud, that there is nothing for him to sign. Mr. DioGuardi?
Well, the Albanians certainly didn't get their wish list at Rambouillet. They had to back off on many things, and they did it under great pressure from the United States of America. But what you've just heard is typical Serb propaganda, and they've been saying this for years. You know, we keep hearing that this is an ethnic conflict with religious overtones. What we really have to see here is what happened in 1989. The Albanians were the first to declare themselves for democracy from the former communist state of Yugoslavia. In 1989, 700,000 Albanians threw their Communist Party cards in the bonfire. And that's what started their problem with Slobodan Milosevic, because he's the last vestige of Stalinist communism in Europe. He controls everything. He controls the entire system in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, the press, the universities, the army. He fires people when he wants, and he controls the message. And he has programmed all of his officials with the same message. Look at the outrageous statement made yesterday by one of his officials when they asked about the refugees, and he said, well, that was one Albanian family taking a walk in the park when we saw the villages being torched and the kids and the people being executed. This is the kind of regime that has to be removed from Europe today. I congratulate President Clinton for the wonderful case he made. I'm a Republican, and I congratulate him for the wonderful case he made to the American people, and he's right. We have an interest there. We need a Europe that's united, free, and prosperous. That affects all of us. And one last thing, Bobby. I am a volunteer president of the Albanian American Civic League. It is a registered lobby, but we're all volunteers. And we represent the concerns and interests of 400,000 Albanian Americans. Imagine, we have in America 400,000 Albanians, and they are not far removed from what's going on there. Their families are being killed, and we have a big interest in this. This part of the Balkans, Kosovo, was part of the state of Albania that came out of the Ottoman Empire on November the 28th, 1912. That's why you have so many Albanians there. The Albanians are the only indigenous people in the Balkans. They've been there for 10,000 years. The Serbs came from the Ukraine. They came from Russia 600 AD. When they talk about this mythical battle in 1389, sure, it was a battle that they lost. They fought side by side with Christian Albanians. All Albanians were Christians before the Ottoman Turks came in, but you'll never hear that from the Serbs, because they've been programmed by the Stalinist communist system that they have. I mean, this gentleman may be a good man, but I can tell you he's been programmed very well. There's hardly democracy in Belgrade when you saw a prominent general being fired just for merely disagreeing, a prominent university professor at the law school there being fired. There is no democracy, so I would not refer to him as a democratically elected president. As a matter of fact, 100,000 and more Serbs are on the streets of Belgrade because of the elections being fixed, and it wasn't until he turned around and changed the election result that they then, you know, there was peace. But you have here a terrible situation. You've got a man, Slobodan Milosevic, and the world can't be wrong. He's been indicted by the U.S. House of Representatives last September, the U.S. Senate last June, the European Parliament last September, all said in unanimous resolutions that for his actions, brutal actions, genocide, ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and Kosovo, he should be brought to The Hague and tried as a war criminal. I don't see why we're even talking to this man, why Mr. Holbrooke's wasting his time. What interest does the United States have in negotiating a peace with a war criminal? That's what he is. Everybody cannot be wrong.
Can this conflict, it is a long-standing civil war, can it be solved without military action, outside military action, and without the removal? It sounds to me a few moments ago you were, between the lines, espousing the removal of Mr. Milosevic.
No, it can't, because this is not just a recent action. You have to go back to 1989 when Mr. Milosevic walked into Kosovo and brutally took away its autonomy. Under the Constitution of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, 1946, and amended in 1974, Kosovo was considered a separate territory autonomous, and it had an equal vote to Serbia. This is a fact. It had an equal vote to Serbia in the former Yugoslavia. In fact, every 8 years, the president of Yugoslavia was an Albanian. It had its own parliament. It had its own self-administration, own police force, own courts, own school system, own hospitals. Milosevic came in and in one fell swoop, with a gun to the head of every Albanian parliamentarian, took that away.
Well, you know what, with all due respect, that was then. This is now.
Well, but
can the
point
two
is,
sides make
yes,
it work?
Well, it can't, because we saw what he did in Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia. We acted 2 years too late in Bosnia, and we lost 250,000 people. Only after we struck with our force from the air did Milosevic come to the peace table at Dayton. The same has to happen now. It's the only thing he understands. In fact, he has painted himself in a corner. He knows he can't give up Kosovo without losing his power in Belgrade, so he is willing to take the strikes now to keep that power. It's the only way he'll give up Kosovo.
And joining us now from New York to talk more about the crisis and the U.S. congressional debate on Kosovo policy is former Congressman Joseph DioGuardi. Mr. DioGuardi is also president of the Albanian American Civic League. Mr. DioGuardi, we're hearing mixed reports. Earlier we heard that it was relatively quiet, and now we're hearing there are mixed instances of some violence. Have you heard from any of the people back there?
In fact, just on the way down to your studios here in New York, I received a call, and I was told that fighting started again in the village of Lyusha, which is one of the 4 villages in this Stranica region. So I think we're going to see a continuation of this. You know, we've seen how Mr. Milosevic responds because of our experience in Bosnia. Unless the West is prepared to take swift action, I've heard the strong words in Congress and Mrs. Madeleine Albright's strong words, but unless we're prepared to take swift action, you will not see Mr. Milosevic back off.
What do you mean by swift action?
Well, we just had a congressional hearing, and I was delighted to see that a hearing that was called on Bosnia, and it was because in great part of the efforts of our Albanian American Civic League that we shifted the emphasis of that hearing to Kosovo. And there was a lot of tough talk from Ambassador Gelbard and from the administration. But talk does not work. In terms of swift action, we need to do what we did in Bosnia 2 years too late.
In other words, you're talking about military.
Well, we need to establish a no-fly zone immediately. We know that they're using heavily armed helicopters. There's no reason for that kind of force to be used against innocent civilians. We should be ringing the border of Yugoslavia right now with NATO troops in Macedonia, in Bulgaria, in Montenegro. There's no reason why we shouldn't show Mr. Milosevic that the West is resolved to see this conflict contained and to see the political rights of the Albanian people, long-suffering Albanian people of Kosovo, finally addressed.
In your view, where is the holdup? Is it in Congress or elsewhere?
Well, it appears that our State Department is thinking long and hard about the actions. We like the tone of the statements made by the Secretary of State and by Ambassador Gelbard, but there should be no secret as to what works with Mr. Milosevic. In fact, he should be on the list of war criminals in The Hague. Why we have embraced the person who started the Balkan conflict back in Kosovo in 1989, the war in Slovenia in 1991, and then Croatia, and then Bosnia, and put him at the peace table at the Dayton Accords, I don't know. It was Congressman Dana Rohrabacher who said to Ambassador Gelbard, is Mr. Milosevic, and he said it euphemistically, on the list of war criminals? And Gelbard said no, and then Rohrabacher says, but we're dealing with all of his buddies who are war criminals, Mr. Karadzic, Mr. Milosevic. We have to understand that you cannot trust Mr. Milosevic. Look at his actions, and you'll see what he's about to do in Kosovo.
Okay, I can tell you this, that the Pentagon is saying now that absolutely no consideration is given, or is being given, to sending in troops either from Canada or the United States.
Well, we already have a force in Macedonia. I can't believe that they're not considering right now to expand that force, that protection force made up now of U.S. troops and Norwegian troops. I believe it totals about 600. It seems to me that the only answer right now is to show resolve. We didn't show it for 2 years in Bosnia, and we lost 200,000 people, and we had a conflagration there second to none.
Let me ask you this. The ministers of the European Union are suggesting that further sanctions should be imposed in Belgrade. Is that going to work?
Sanctions don't seem to work with Mr. Milosevic. That's what the hearing was all about. We did get a very tough resolution. It was made even tougher because of the efforts of the Albanian American Civic League that represents the concerns of 400,000 ethnic Albanians here in America. But sanctions will not be enough. We need to show resolve. We should move an aircraft carrier off the coast of Montenegro. Let it stay there. We should ring Serbia with troops. Let them stay there. If we see one move, and don't forget, Ralph, two presidents drew a line in the sand. President Bush on the way out and President Clinton on the way in said if there's any military or paramilitary action in Kosovo, we would move swiftly. That question was put to Mr. Gelbard, Ambassador Gelbard, and he said that foreign policy declaration is still in effect.
Do you think that kind of activity worked in Bosnia?
Absolutely. The only time we saw the Serbian regime come to the table to try to resolve something was when they knew the West was ready to act.
We only have a few more moments. Let me ask you this. To many people, it's a very, very confusing story, and you have to go back into history. How did the ethnic Albanians get into the situation in the first place?
It is a very confusing story, but let me say this. The ethnic Albanians of Kosovo were there for over 5,000 years. You can't believe the Serbian propaganda machine. They did not move to Kosovo or Macedonia or Montenegro. This is one half of the divided nation of Albanians. You have 3.5 million Albanians in the state of Albania and 3.5 just outside its borders. Okay. And they were there.
Joseph DioGuardi, thank you very much for sharing your views and perspective with us today.
Joe DioGuardi, let me start with you. You're lobbying the U.S. administration on Kosovo. Where does the issue appear on the list of the U.S. administration's priorities in the first place?
First, let me say that I'm the volunteer president of the Albanian American Civic League, the only registered lobby of the Albanian people here in America, representing the concerns and interests of some 400,000 Albanian Americans, and Kosovo is at the top of our list. I try to go to Washington as much as I can. I was there yesterday to speak in front of the Institute of Peace. There were many people from the State Department there to let them know that our foreign policy is a mess, it's failing, that they have blood on their hands. Mr. Holbrooke has blood on his hands. NATO has already discredited itself. We've been through this before. We saw it in Bosnia. We diddled, waffled, and dawdled for 3 years, saying that nothing could be done, and then finally, we couldn't take the bloodshed anymore after seeing Srebrenica and the Market Square in Sarajevo. We're seeing it right now in Kosovo, and we acted.
Okay, I'm going to get on to our first caller who's standing with a call already from London. Malika, your question, please.
All right, my question is for Mr. DioGuardi, and I would like the same question for Mr. Malcolm. I would like to know how far international community is going to with the efforts to bring this crisis to an end, and when the international community will realize that the best solution to the Kosovo crisis is by recognition to the Kosovo independence.
DioGuardi, let's get your quick response to that, too.
Well, I definitely agree with Noel. Independence is the only option. It's the one that was selected by the Albanian people of Kosovo in 1992 when they had a referendum. They selected independence. A bill was introduced last week making a prima facie case that Kosovo meets all of the indicia under international law for independence as a nation. So why is our State Department saying that independence is off the table? That is what's causing this battle to go on and no dialogue to begin.
Hi, my question is, why wouldn't the Serbs crack down in Kosovo? Everyone was a lot of promises, so it's not going to repeat another Bosnia. So where is these promises now? What is a Bosnia was different than Kosovo is now?
Joseph DioGuardi, what do you think?
Well, it's obvious that there is no difference. The only difference between Bosnia and Kosovo right now is that we have troops in Bosnia. That's why it's not falling apart. We don't have troops in Kosovo. We have to show resolve with Mr. Milosevic. We know his modus operandi, his M.O. When he senses waffling, when he senses some indecision, he tends to move. Don't forget, his biggest concern is his political base in Belgrade. He's a Stalinist communist. He's lied to the people of Serbia. He controls all the media. And what he wants to do is to increase his own power there, and he's using the blood of the Albanian people in Kosovo. It's a mess, and the only one that can resolve this right now is the only superpower to do it, the United States of America, and we've got to get Madeleine Albright talking tough again, and she should not be muffled by Sandy Berger and Mr. Holbrooke has blood on his hands for dealing with Mr. Milosevic.
Well,
he's a war criminal, and he's got to be treated that way.
I'm going to get to a question that's going on our internet chat room as we go out live. It says, why hasn't Albania jumped in and helped their fellow Albanians?
On the way down, on my cellular phone, I received a call from one of our contacts in Albania, and as we're speaking, the Albanian parliament is meeting, and it's significant that I was told that the socialists are now joining with the opposition to mobilize the army, and they've ordered Fatos Nano, the prime minister, who, by the way, is vacationing in Greece, of all places, for the Albanians, and to get back to Tirana. So what I'm saying is that this could be our worst fears being confirmed, that this will now spread into a Balkan war, and that's why our foreign policy here is failing.
And Joe, how reliable are your sources on that information?
Well, they were watching today TV in Tirana, and this was going on as he was calling me on the phone.
This email question from Lahore in Pakistan, Farhana Sayed says, if reports of mass graves had been confirmed, would the EU and NATO be more likely to act then?
I believe they already know there are mass graves. Don't forget what happened 3 years ago. Our State Department covered up. They knew there were mass graves. That's why several senior officials resigned. This is a moral issue right now, and it's outrageous. In fact, an article was just written by our Balkan Affairs advisor, Shirley Cloyes, of the Albanian American Civic League, and she quotes Congressman Lantos, who knows oppression. He was someone who was saved from the Nazi Holocaust, and he goes, quote, "We have a moral obligation to identify with the people of Kosovo. They have been persecuted, discriminated against, and killed by a police state. Kosovo Albanians have suffered enough." That's Tom Lantos in the House of Representatives on March 12th. There's no question there are mass graves there. We just don't want to admit it because we're not willing to show resolve. That's the only way we're going to solve this.
London on the line, Surinder's on the line. Go ahead, Surinder. I understand you're 13 years old.
Hi, I'd like to ask Mr. DioGuardi, why is NATO formed, and how many children have to be killed for the NATO to take action?
Joe DioGuardi.
Well, this is a question I hear all the time from the Albanian people. How many hundreds of thousands of Albanians should be killed before the West acts, before the United States acts? It took 300,000 Bosnians. We have to ask our State Department and the rest of the world, how many Albanians have to be killed before you act?
Yeah, can I do the question?
Please, yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Mr. DioGuardi has often repeated that American administration has failed in Balkan. So I want to ask if exists any possibility for solution to save Albanians, to save Kosovo, and to put peace in Balkan. This is my question.
Well, the only way to do it is what we did 3 years too late in Bosnia. We have to take the lead. We have to show Mr. Milosevic that there is pain he has to take for his actions. Sanctions will not work. We have seen this over and over again. Only the credible threat of force or the use of it. And that doesn't mean that we have to commit U.S. troops to Kosovo. As we saw in Bosnia 3 years later, 3 years after we should have acted, we did some surgical things, military actions that sent the signal that the time was up for Mr. Milosevic, and he backed off. We have to do the same things now.
Welcome back. In the long hours at Rambouillet, the Kosovo-Albanian delegation was asked to put its faith in Western promises of military protection and significant political gains. Madeleine Albright called it the best deal they could hope for. The Albanians agreed in principle, but they didn't sign. Was that a mistake? Joining us now is Joe DioGuardi, a former U.S. Congressman, now with the Albanian American Civic League. Thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure, Jonathan.
Why didn't they sign, and what does agreement in principle really amount to, do you think?
Well, they didn't sign for a simple reason, because the agreement as it stands now would be nothing less than a death warrant for the Albanian Kosovars. You have to remember how this began. It began in 1987 when Slobodan Milosevic rose to power by coming to Kosovo on a platform of anti-Albanian racism and Greater Serbia. He occupied Kosovo in 1989, took away all the jobs, all the schools, all the courts, the separate parliament of Kosovo. Everything was removed. The Kosovars have lived in a concentration camp for 10 years. There's been nothing like this since Adolf Hitler created the concentration camps in Germany. They cannot go back. They have declared their independence in a referendum in 1991. The Slovenes did, and they got out. The Croatians did, and they got out. The Bosnians did, and they got out. And by the way, they are all Slavs, just like the Serbs. the Albanians are not Slavs, why should they be forced to live with people who treat them like untermenschens?
So let me ask you, once again, they left with the impression that they agreed in principle. Were they just being polite? Is this really a non-starter to any Kosovar Albanian nationalist, this kind of a deal?
I believe that what happened in Rambouillet was a failure. I predicted it would be, because unless we were prepared to use force, and we have declared that we were prepared, how many times I can't count. The only reason that the carnage in Bosnia stopped is that we finally, after 2 years, after losing 250,000 people, struck the military installations of Slobodan Milosevic, and then Dayton began. There were no strikes before Rambouillet. There were no troops put into Kosovo. So why should Milosevic believe in anything? And by the way, he didn't go to Rambouillet. These talks were doomed to begin with. And now the appearance is being given that the burden for not signing is being put on the Albanian Kosovars. It's wrong. And now they're creating parity. I heard the deputy ambassador. The real terrorist is Slobodan Milosevic. He's been in effect indicted by the U.S. Senate in a resolution last June, by the U.S. House of Representatives in a resolution last September, a month later by the European Parliament. All have said that his acts in Bosnia and Kosovo are enough to bring him to The Hague to be indicted as a war criminal. Why are we dealing with a war criminal? Why is Holbrooke and Hill spending any time with this man?
Well, let me jump in and ask you a
law.
question. The U.S. government has been reluctant as well to throw in its lot with the KLA. There's a feeling in Washington, I don't have to tell you, that the KLA are a proto-terrorist group who were themselves responsible for ethnic cleansing of Serbs, getting them out of Kosovo.
Not at all. This is Serbian propaganda, and when we approached a hearing on March 12th, just about a year ago, when the word terrorist was mistakenly used by Gelbard. He was asked questions by Congressman Gilman and Congressman Lee Hamilton, then the ranking Democrat. He backed right off. He says, no, it has not been declared a terrorist organization. These people are freedom fighters. How many years can you live under the control of a brutal dictator with your families being killed, towns being destroyed, people being disappeared and tortured, until you say we now have to defend ourselves because we see the West is not willing to defend us?
If that's the case, and if that's the conclusion that they've drawn, and if that's the right conclusion, March 15th, they're going to be called back to France and asked to disarm and put their faith in a Western guaranteed agreement with Slobodan Milosevic. Should Kosovar Albanians agree to anything of that kind, giving up weapons and hoping for the best for the future in March or at any other time?
I doubt that they will, because we have seen from experience that you cannot trust Slobodan Milosevic. He's a liar. He's a war criminal. He's an ultra-nationalist who's now breaking bread with Mr. Zyganov in Russia and Belarus. He's trying to create a new greater Serbia that goes way beyond the Balkans. How can we trust this man? Without U.S. troops as part of a NATO force in Kosovo, nothing can begin. And it seems to me that they didn't want to discuss that. And what happened was Madeleine Albright, to save face, shifted in the last few days to blaming the Albanians for not signing, because she knew the Serbs would never accept a U.S. peacekeeping or a NATO peacekeeping force.
Joe DioGuardi of the Albanian American Civic League. Thanks so much for this.
Thank you.